Well, you could say I'm playing with you. I guess I really am.
On May 31st, 1986, 6-year-old Michele Dorr disappeared from a quiet suburban neighbourhood in Silver Spring, Maryland. Earlier that afternoon, she had been outside playing in a small plastic pool behind her father's house. Nothing about the street appeared unusual. Children regularly played around the nearby homes, and the neighbourhood was considered safe enough that parents rarely worried about the kids walking short distances between houses. When Michele suddenly vanished, police immediately focused on the people closest to her. Her father quickly became the centre of the investigation. Detectives interrogated him repeatedly over the following months and years, eventually pushing him into a severe psychological collapse that included false confessions, delusions, and repeated psychiatric hospitalizations. But while investigators were concentrating on Michele's father, another man had already begun drawing attention during police interviews. That man was Hadden Clark. At the time, Clark was living only a few doors away from Michele. During questioning, detectives noticed his behaviour becoming increasingly strange and erratic whenever Michele's name was mentioned. According to investigators, Clark began rocking back and forth in his chair while avoiding eye contact. Then he suddenly asked to use the bathroom. Moments later, detectives reportedly heard him vomiting violently inside one of the police station stalls. One investigator slid a photograph of Michele beneath the bathroom door and demanded to know what he did to her. Clark's response would later become one of the most infamous moments in the entire investigation. "I may have done something." He then added another disturbing statement. "Sometimes I black out." Let's dive right into the highly disturbing world of Hadden Clark. You have been warned. By the way, this is Dark Case, and you can call me Jack. I bring you daily true crime, dark content, and other things that you may later regret knowing. And Dark Case family, we did it. We have finally hit 300 channel members, and we achieved it before the end of May, so I really can't thank you all enough, but thank you so much. Because the future of the channel really does kind of depend on this. I'm now aiming for 500 channel members by the end of June 2026. So please, if you feel like you can and you want to support the channel, you're allowing me to keep on doing this. Now for today's silly little question. You can only drink one liquid for the rest of your life. What is it? Let me know down in the comments. And now, on with the video. Years before investigators connected Hadden Clark to the disappearance of Michele Dorr, there had already been repeated signs that something was seriously wrong. Although the Clark family appeared successful from the outside, the home itself was reportedly chaotic and deeply unstable behind closed doors. Clark's grandfather had once served as mayor of White Plains, New York, and his father was a highly educated chemist who helped develop commercial products used across the United States. But according to later reports and psychological summaries, both of Clark's parents struggled heavily with alcoholism, and violent arguments allegedly took place regularly in front of the children. Clark himself appeared emotionally unstable from a very young age. Witnesses and family members later described behaviour that disturbed people long before he became linked to murder investigations. As a child, Clark allegedly mutilated animals and left dead pets belonging to neighbourhood children after disputes or bullying incidents. His mother reportedly dressed him in girls' clothing while intoxicated and referred to him as Kristen, while his father allegedly mocked and humiliated him repeatedly throughout childhood. Over time, Clark reportedly became increasingly isolated, emotionally volatile, and socially detached. Despite these issues, he was still intelligent enough to graduate from the Culinary Institute of America in 1974 and briefly worked as a professional chef. But even during adulthood, people around him continued reporting bizarre behaviour. Co-workers later claimed he drank raw beef blood in restaurant kitchens and sabotaged food after arguments with other staff members. Clark struggled to maintain employment anywhere for long periods of time, and his instability eventually followed him into military service after he joined the United States Navy as a cook. In 1985, he received a medical discharge after being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. By the mid-1980s, his life had become increasingly chaotic. He drifted between temporary jobs, arrests, psychiatric evaluations, and periods of homelessness, while also repeatedly stealing women's clothing and cross-dressing in public. According to later medical records, Clark sometimes claimed he experienced blackouts and periods of time where he could not remember his own actions. Those statements would later become extremely important after a 6-year-old girl vanished only a short distance from where he was living. On the afternoon of May 31st, 1986, Michele Dorr was spending the weekend with her father, Carl Dorr, at his home in Silver Spring, Maryland. The weather was unusually hot, and Michele had spent part of the afternoon outside playing in a small turtle-shaped plastic pool in the backyard. According to later testimony, Carl eventually went back inside the house, while Michele continued playing outdoors. At some point during the afternoon, Michele appears to have wandered away from the backyard and toward the nearby home where her friend Elizabeth Clark lived. Elizabeth was the niece of Hadden. At the same time that Michele disappeared, Clark was in the middle of moving belongings out of his brother Jeffrey Clark's house nearby. Witnesses later reported seeing him carrying bags and boxes to his white pickup truck throughout the afternoon. This timing would later become one of the most important parts of the entire investigation. Initially, Carl Dorr believed Michele was probably inside the Clark home playing with Elizabeth, but when he eventually went looking for her, nobody could find the little girl anywhere. Police were contacted shortly afterward, and investigators immediately began trying to reconstruct the timeline of that afternoon. One witness quickly became extremely important. A local worker named O'Neill Cammock later told police that he entered the Clark residence that same day in order to use the telephone. According to investigative notes, Cammock stated that a young white girl was inside the home at the time. However, he reportedly insisted the child was not Michele Dorr. The statement created immediate confusion for investigators because it suggested another child had been present inside the house shortly after Michele disappeared. It also placed Hadden Clark inside the residence during the critical time window. Days later, detectives brought Clark in for formal questioning. At first, he appeared calm enough to answer routine questions about his movements. He admitted he had briefly returned to the house that afternoon, and also admitted allowing a man to use the telephone. But according to investigators, his behaviour changed dramatically once detectives began directly discussing Michele. Clark reportedly became visibly distressed. He avoided eye contact. He rocked back and forth in his chair. Then he suddenly asked to use the bathroom. Inside the restroom, detectives later said they could hear him vomiting violently. One investigator pushed a photograph of Michele beneath the bathroom stall and then demanded answers. Clark reportedly responded by saying, "I may have done something." He also claimed he sometimes blacked out and committed acts he could not remember afterward. For police, the interview felt deeply unsettling. But there was a major problem. Clark's work record showed he clocked into his job at the Chevy Chase Country Club at 2:46 p.m. that afternoon. The drive reportedly took around 10 minutes. Based on the timeline police believed to be accurate, detectives struggled to understand how Clark could have abducted Michele, hidden evidence, and still arrived at work so quickly. That uncertainty would become one of the biggest reasons he was allowed to leave the station. And while police continued searching for Michele Dorr, the man many investigators already felt uneasy about simply walked back into normal life. While suspicion around Hadden Clark never completely disappeared, the investigation soon became overwhelmingly focused on Michele's father instead. From the beginning, detectives believed the statistics pointed towards somebody close to the child. And because Carl Dorr had been the last confirmed person to see Michele alive, investigators treated him as the most likely suspect. Over time, the pressure on him became relentless. Police monitored his movements, reviewed his finances, examined his personal relationships, and repeatedly interrogated him for hours at a time. According to later court records, Investigators admitted they screamed at him, cursed at him, and attempted to psychologically break him down during questioning. At the same time, Michele's disappearance was becoming a major media story across Maryland. Public pressure intensified. Rumors spread through the community, and eventually Carl Dorr began suffering severe psychological deterioration. He reportedly experienced multiple nervous breakdowns and developed increasingly bizarre religious delusions. At one point, he became convinced he was Jesus Christ and believed he could somehow bring Michele back to life if he found her. During different breakdowns, he also gave multiple contradictory confessions that investigators later considered unreliable. In one version, he claimed that he suffocated Michele. In another, he claimed he buried her body near a graveyard. At another point, he allegedly claimed he disposed of her remains in a sewer. But none of the stories matched available evidence, and investigators could never corroborate any of them. Meanwhile, Hadden Clark remained free. Years passed without Michele being found. Then, in 1992, another young woman disappeared in Montgomery County, and suddenly investigators found themselves looking at Clark all over again. In 1992, Laura Houghteling was living with her mother, Penny Houghteling, in Bethesda, Maryland. Laura had recently graduated from Harvard and was widely viewed by friends and family as exceptionally intelligent and ambitious. Around this same period, Hadden Clark had begun working for the family as a gardener and handyman. According to later testimony, Penny Houghteling initially viewed him as harmless and even trusted him enough to allow him access to the house while she was away. But over time, strange things reportedly began happening inside the home. Jewelry disappeared, clothing went missing, and investigators later believed Clark had become emotionally attached to Penny in an unhealthy and increasingly obsessive way. When Laura returned home after graduation, prosecutors later argued that Clark became jealous of the attention Penny gave her daughter. Then, on October 14, 1992, Clark purchased several items that would later become extremely important to investigators. Those items included duct tape, braided rope, and nylon cord. According to court records, the memo line on the check reportedly contained a single word: Laura. 4 days later, Laura disappeared. At first, nobody immediately understood what had happened. Friends became concerned after she failed to arrive at work and stopped answering calls. Family members searched the home and surrounding area, but there was no obvious sign of forced entry or a struggle. Very quickly, police began looking closely at Hadden Clark. Investigators already knew about his connection to Michele Dorr's case, and several details immediately disturbed them. Then came the discovery that transformed the investigation completely. Police recovered a bloody pillowcase connected to Laura's disappearance. On that pillowcase, investigators found a fingerprint allegedly belonging to Clark. For detectives who had spent years haunted by Michele Dorr's case, it suddenly felt possible they were dealing with something far more dangerous than they originally believed. Clark was arrested and interrogated again. According to reports, he cried repeatedly during questioning and claimed he could not remember parts of what had happened. But this time, investigators had physical evidence tying him directly to the crime. And so, in 1993, Clark pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in Laura Houghteling's death. Then, shortly afterward, he led police to her buried remains. The case immediately forced investigators to re-examine everything surrounding Michele Dorr's disappearance 6 years earlier, because suddenly, the strange man who vomited during questioning in 1986 was no longer simply a suspicious neighbor with mental health problems. He was now a convicted killer, and investigators began wondering whether they had, in reality, nearly caught Michele's murderer all those years earlier, only to let him walk away because of a timeline that may never have been accurate in the first place. After Hadden Clark entered prison, the Michele Dorr investigation changed dramatically once again. Multiple inmates later claimed Clark confessed to murdering Michele while behind bars. According to testimony, one inmate alleged Clark described attacking Michele inside his niece's bedroom before placing her body into bags and removing her from the house. Another inmate claimed Clark suddenly panicked after realizing how much information he had revealed. Investigators also returned to the Clark residence and examined the bedroom connected to the allegations. Using luminol testing beneath the floorboards, investigators discovered multiple traces of blood. An FBI expert later testified that the number of blood locations exceeded what investigators would normally expect from normal explainable injuries, like scraped knees, alone. However, the forensic evidence later became heavily disputed during trial proceedings because DNA testing could not conclusively identify Michele as the source. Even so, prosecutors believed the overall evidence against Clark had become overwhelming. In 1999, more than 13 years after Michele vanished, Clark was convicted of her murder despite the fact her body had still not been recovered. Then, after the appeal process began, Clark suddenly started cooperating with authorities. On January 7, 2000, he led investigators to a wooded ravine near Silver Spring, Maryland. There, buried in a shallow grave, police finally recovered Michele Dorr's remains. For many investigators, the discovery felt both devastating and surreal. After more than a decade of uncertainty, the child at the center of one of Maryland's most disturbing missing persons cases had finally been found only minutes away from where she disappeared. But even after Michele's recovery, the story still did not end. Over the years, some of the most disturbing allegations surrounding Hadden Clark involved claims of cannibalism after the murders. Multiple jailhouse witnesses later alleged that Clark confessed to consuming parts of victims' remains. Clark himself also made several bizarre statements during later interviews and investigations that appeared to reference consuming flesh or drinking vital fluids. However, investigators were never able to fully verify many of those claims through forensic evidence, and some detectives believed Clark mixed truth, fantasy, and shock value together deliberately. Even so, the allegations became a major reason many investigators feared Clark may have been responsible for far more crimes than the 2 murders he was ultimately convicted of. Clark soon began making additional claims about murders across several states, including Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Vermont. Authorities searched wooded areas and family property connected to Clark in Cape Cod after he allegedly described burial locations to investigators. During one search, police discovered a buried bucket containing around 200 pieces of women's jewelry. Some of the items belonged to Laura Houghteling. Clark allegedly described the collection as trophies. But despite years of investigation, many of Clark's additional murder claims were never verified. Some investigators believed he was responsible for more deaths. Others believed his schizophrenia, attention-seeking behaviour, and tendency to mix fantasy with reality made many of his stories unreliable. And that uncertainty remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case. Because while there is no doubt Hadden Clark murdered Michele Dorr and Laura Houghteling, investigators were never able to fully determine where the truth ended and the fiction began. Even today, there are still unanswered questions surrounding how many crimes he may actually have committed before finally being stopped. While serving his sentence, Hadden Clark created strange drawings and artwork that later circulated among true crime collectors online. Some of the sketches appeared childlike and disjointed, while others focused on religious imagery, distorted faces, or female figures connected to the alternate identity known as Kristen, the same name his mother allegedly called him during childhood. People who claimed to correspond with Clark through letters described receiving hand-drawn images directly from prison over the years. For some observers, the artwork felt less like ordinary prison hobby material and more like another extension of the same deeply fractured personality investigators had struggled to understand for decades. Even after his convictions, there remained a constant uncertainty around Clark. How much of his behaviour came from genuine psychological collapse, and how much was manipulation, performance, or an attempt to keep people fascinated by and talking about him long after the murders were over. Thank you so much for watching. I'm uploading daily true crime and dark content here on this channel, so make sure that you're subscribed, hit like on the video, and also drop a comment so you get shown more of my stuff. Please do be careful out there, and I'll see you tomorrow.